Earlier this year, California passed a law that said that gig economy workers can no longer misclassify their workers in order to pay them less. It basically required that companies like Instacart and Uber have to classify their employees as their employees. And Proposition 22 is a proposition pushed by these gig economy corporations to try and reverse that. People who work in these gig economy contract worker situations have less worker rights, they have less benefits, they don't have the rights of an employee. And that loophole allowed for these corporations to exploit their labor even more than you typically would if you had just been an employee for a company. So companies like Uber and Instacart are dumping tons of money into trying to get this proposition through. And what this has resulted in is it being one of the most expensive referendums in American history. Right now, about $180 million have been poured into the Proposition 22 campaign. They're dumping tons of money into advertisements, that's for sure. But they're also hiring people to harass and troll people online. One notable example that's become public is a journalist who specializes in reporting on the gig economy has had one harasser who has doxed her, which means published her address publicly, and threatened her life to the point where she had to spend several nights with all of her doors locked and all of her family just sleeping in one room. And this harasser was paid by this campaign. And they're going to this extent because there are billions of dollars in wage theft to be had. And you know, we've been having this conversation about bots and trolls and online harassment as part of our political discourse to the point where it has turned into its own industry, and it's turning into a new front in a very old war. So to talk about this and break it down, I'm calling it the trolling industrial complex. And once I dug in, including talking to one of my friends who's an expert on this, I started to realize that there's a lot more to this than I thought. I bit off way more than I could chew, and so this is going to be a brief overview of some interesting things, but I definitely am going to chew deeper on a lot of different ones that I bring up. And how this video does and how you comment determines how I'm going to do that. Hi, I'm a fat freak trying to make sense of the world, and this is Tristan Won't Shut Up. Politics has always been messy. You know, whether it be the olden days of just grabbing people off the street and getting them shit-faced so that they can go and vote for you at multiple different locations, change their clothes, vote again, and then you just dump them in a ditch. Or today, where social media has made figuring out what is a popular opinion versus a marginal one, or who is trying to be divisive, or anything is becoming more and more murky due to the rising tide of bot accounts, paid harassers, and sponsored content. So what is this industry trying to do? The first is astroturfing. Now, astroturfing isn't new. I'm sure many of you remember the Tea Party movement of 2008, 2009, 2010, which was a conservative grassroots movement. And while saying it was against taxes, was never really specific about what taxes or anything like that. It was very successful, but it was not natural. It wasn't actually a grassroots movement. It was an intentionally paid for and organized movement by the Koch brothers. Today, you don't need to corral real people together, although they still do that. Now, with the use of bot networks or paid trolls, you can actually raise the profile of a policy idea or opposition to a policy that is marginal and make it seem a lot more popular than it actually is to trick politicians into doing the bidding of their bidders once again. Oftentimes, it's also used to sow division. Very often, very cleverly, they will listen and pay attention to what sort of fault lines exist in a movement and create trolls or create bots that will speak and try to amp up those differences to create cracks in a movement in order to sow more division. And when it's something like the left that has a whole lot of divisions that are sort of always being held together by a very flimsy alliance of convenience, it's doing very well at cracking everything up. And of course, it's also used to intimidate and harass. I think one of the most famous cases we can talk about is Anita Sarkeesian, who essentially had a hate mob try to drive her off the internet. Funnily, a lot of people who were free speech absolutists later, but they tried to drive her off the internet for daring to speak about the WOMs in the video games. But in the case of Proposition 22, we've already seen online harassment being used to intimidate people out of criticizing the proposition. And this is a common tactic that comes up over and over again in online discourse. Look how often mass flagging campaigns are used to take down videos, or how often threats and doxing and harassment are used to try and silence voices. Mostly left-wing voices, lad. That's not good. That is a process of using artificial tools and paying people to do some of the most heinous in order to advance very nefarious political agendas. And of course, there's the advertorial section. This is a bit of a interesting, odd section out that maybe we'll have to talk about more in its own video. But advertisers, realizing that advertising is having less and less of an impact on people, are now basically paying content creators to make content for them. Sometimes it's sponsored, hey, Skillshare, but oftentimes it's made to look and sound like content and used to try and sell a product or try to sell a political agenda. We'll get into those a little bit later. Now, who's doing this? I've tried to look into different areas about where it's going, and I do think that these are all going to have to be different investigations, different videos altogether. Again, too big. Many governments are setting up small departments to try and hire people to harass and troll and promote ideas that are trying to advance either the regime that is running a state domestically or trying to advance their geopolitical strategies abroad. One is Russia, which has a very sophisticated department of trying to drum up chaos in a lot of their geopolitical rivals or in, neighboring states in order to advance their agenda, to weaken the state so that they can kind of come in and exert more influence. And another is Israel, which has an open program of trying to give prizes and scholarships to people who will comment on news stories to support the state of Israel. Then there's just psychopaths, people who are savvy with these kinds of tools and want to use it to advance horrible political machinations, but aren't necessarily governments. What comes to mind to me is 8chan, which is a fascist hate group that is using a lot of online harassment, doxing, and these kinds of things to intimidate and push and try to elevate fascist ideas, especially white supremacist, white nationalist, neo-Nazi ideas. You've got corporations, oil and gas magnates, you've got Koch Industries, and all of the shadowy, dark right-wing money that funds things like Ben Shapiro, and of course, what we're seeing here with Proposition 22 with all of these gig economy companies. And the last topic I have is sort of just one I threw on at the end, which is grifters. A lot of people will use these tools in order to prop up attention to some sort of shady product or some sort of way to make a quick buck. One example I can think of are the Krasenstein brothers. And what techniques are they using? What are like the actual ways they're doing it? One example would be paid trolls or paid provocateurs. Israel has one called Act.il, which, as I mentioned earlier, gives prizes and scholarships to people who will sign up and comment on news articles supporting the state of Israel, which in this situation, usually supporting the state of Israel is terms for denying Palestinian people human rights. Another famous case, of course, is Russia in the 2016 US election, where it's unclear whether the content they made was any good. And what I'm learning is it doesn't even have to be that good to be effective. It just needs to flood. It just needs to be bulky and take up space in order to just sow chaos and get people to either drift towards extreme positions or just check out altogether. So no matter how effective or ineffective it was, they still tried to do it. And sometimes this is just done with humans, but sometimes it's also done with bots. Software, simple software sometimes, that is designed to mass create accounts on social media platforms and take a message and just repeat it ad nauseum, or just take a message and repeat it ad nauseum, or just take a message and repeat it ad nauseum, or say using features like upvotes, likes, retweets, whatever it works on the platform to try and elevate a message with artificial social media promotion compared to what it might actually merit. And just raising the volume of these ideas will either promote ideas that are very marginal or just sow chaos and confusion or doubt. We've learned that our ability to stay clear-headed and objective is very suspect. And so even just creating a seed of doubt could cause a whole bunch of instability. Sometimes they just need to take what some marginal person is pushing and then just amplify that. But also, and probably most commonly, there are cyborgs, which are humans who are sort of shepherding a big collection of bots that use the automatic tools, but also put a human touch onto it. They might be able to craft that perfect tweet and then have a bunch of bots just give it retweets and likes. Or they find a message and they know that this one is pretty good, or at least is on brand for what they're trying to do, and then just send the bots that way. Another more old school way that they might try to amplify or mess up political discourse using bot tools or using social media would be something kind of more akin to what they did with the Tea Party, which is just taking people who have a position and trying to corral them together into an event so that they appear to be more big and more prevalent and more, popular than they actually are. We've seen this with the Liberate X movements earlier this year, where the anti-masking, anti-lockdown people were all going to these events all around America. If you remember, there was like the Liberate Minnesota, Liberate Wisconsin, Liberate blah, blah, blah. That all was actually linked to one group of Republican donors who tried to collect people into a massive mailing list that then Republicans tried to, buy access to. And they actually made on Facebook the Liberate X groups en masse, and it's all linked to like one network, so that they could have all these people come together and do like probably one of the largest super spreader events in the United States. And this is very similar to what the Koch brothers did in order to promote the Tea Party. And then there's just straight up paying people to make content. This can be sometimes used just to sell products, like when I do a Skillshare sponsorship, but that's all transparent. Where things get murky in certain ways is that the this is sponsored content marking that's supposed to be on all of these things can sometimes be very small and sometimes be intentionally made to be hard to find or just disregarded because it's not a very enforced law in the first place. And so companies might sponsor content in a trusted news organization where they're just basically writing articles, making new content that is designed to promote a certain product or idea. Probably the most prevalent of this is the greater right-wing attempt to push social media content in a big way. These people, they have social media platforms that get artificially inflated through advertising that have dark and sort of seedy money about where it comes from and fairly often can be traced back to like oil and gas billionaires. These are your Shapiros, your Rubins, your Crowders, your PragerUs, that kind of stuff. But in this case specifically about Proposition 22, just kind of bringing it back to the thing that started this all, there's also, as I learned, a whole branch of YouTube that is for Uber drivers. Uber drivers who are sharing tips and tricks on how to be a better Uber driver, which, is not a surprise. But what I think is interesting is that a lot of these content creators have been making content that is in support of Proposition 22. And you do a little bit of snooping, you'll find out, man, these people sure are getting a lot of money from Uber to make these videos that are for Proposition 22. So why are they doing it? Why is our world being ruined in such a fashion? Sometimes, very often it's for profit. Either there are firms that specialize in this kind of trolling and harassment campaigns, or for example, like we're seeing with Proposition 22, they're trying to do this in order to push for deregulation, essentially, which then results in them making more money because they can do more wage theft against their employees by classifying them as independent contractors. Oftentimes, this is also done for geopolitical gain. This is to push explicit candidates, to push for support for the regime. A lot of authoritarian leaders during elections will use social media trolls and harassment in order to sort of keep marginal their dissenters. I mean, hell, Jair Bolsonaro was a YouTube star, and there was a certain case of online trolls and harassment used to promote frickin' Duterte in the Philippines. Sometimes it's not used for explicit geopolitical goals. I don't actually think that the Russians were interested in Donald Trump specifically being president, but what they were interested in is just inflating the chaos so that the legitimacy of the American government would be called into question, which, like, if that was their goal, mission accomplished, right? Then there's just straight up activism. Not the activism that I would support, but fascists trying to make America a more racist and white supremacist society. They're using this to achieve that end. And if they can't turn people into fascists, at least make them have more openly racist ideas. But what I'm learning is that this is a field that is growing. It's very complex, but it's not getting a whole lot of attention. And while it is drastically changing the way politics works in our world today, there's not really a simple solution for how we rail it back, or at least try to aid in preserving democratic ideals in this new context we find ourselves in. And at the very least, hopefully through this series, we can get educated about what is happening and maybe even think about ways that we can combat it. Because if you've seen my video I did on polarization in politics, you'll know that there were fault lines already existing. There was already a crackling, collapsing world because of the contradictions within neoliberal capitalism. And I think that this is just making the breakdown happen faster and messier. And the alternative, the only alternative that doesn't end with us all dying, is being actively impeded by these groups. These are new tools, but a very old game. Speaking of my video on polarization, if you haven't seen that yet, you should go and take a look and subscribe if you want to.